Welcome to Music History Monday for March 18th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is Fake It Till You Make It. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We mark the birth of the Russian composer Nikolai Andreyevich Rimsky-Korsakov on March 18th, 1844, 180 years ago today. Born in the Russian town of Tikhvin, roughly 120 miles east of St. Petersburg, Rimsky-Korsakov died at the age of 64 on June 21, 1908, on his estate near the Russian town of Luga, about 85 miles south of St. Petersburg. Advice. A rhetorical question. Is there anyone who doesn't like giving advice? Okay, I'm sure there's someone who doesn't. But frankly, I've yet to meet anyone who isn't prepared to dispense advice at the drop of that proverbial hat. However, receiving advice is an entirely different kettle of mackerel, particularly unsolicited advice, which usually carries with it more than just a whiff of criticism. Truly, when it comes to advice, 'tis better to give than receive. It has been my experience that generic advice in the form of platitudes is, no matter how well intended, useless. Honestly, do we really need to be told that everything happens for a reason? No, in fact, it doesn't. Forgive and forget. Really, just be yourself. As opposed to who? Charlie Manson? Love is the answer. The answer to what? Just figure it out. Oh, that's helpful. You just need to cheer up and remember how lucky you are. Thanks. That was really helpful. You know, as these platitudinous life hacks go, there's no advice above that I couldn't happily do without. However, I will be the very first to admit that some generic advice can be of use. Don't eat yellow snow. Okay. For my 4 kids, for example, all of whom were born in a part of California where it never snows, that can actually be useful advice when encountering snow for the first time. Use sunblock. A classic no-brainer. Never quit your day gig. Best advice of all time. Put on your oxygen mask first. Now, I love this one. I take it to mean that you can't be of any use to anyone unless you've first been of use to yourself. Bend your knees. Oh goodness, how much pain and suffering could we have avoided if we had only heeded those 3 words? Don't lick the bowl. Flush it like a normal person. Go ahead. Tell me that's not sound advice. On those same lines, some sage advice given me by my then elderly father. Never walk past a bathroom without using it. How about this one? Eat whatever you want, and if someone calls you fat, eat them too. Yes, with some fava beans and a nice Chianti. And finally, fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. Like most kids growing up, I had various assumptions about grownups, i.e. adults. As someone who has now presumably been an adult for very nearly half a century, I have learned that my assumptions, a few of which I'll share with you, were all crazy wrong. Assumption number 1. At around 21, we cross the line into adulthood. Wrong. There are no such lines. We're all changing all the time. Assumption number 2. Adults are emotionally mature. Wrong. Physically, yes, I'm pushing 70. Emotionally, I'm roughly 15 on a good day. Assumption number 3. Adults know what they're doing. Really? Adults only know what they're doing if they ever learn what they're doing at all after they've been doing it for decades. Until then, they are apprentices, learning on the job, which are nice ways of saying faking it. Growing up, I had no concept of this. I just assumed that once you got to a certain age, you actually knew what you were doing. Oh, silly me. I was disabused of that bit of foolishness as soon as I entered the job market when, at the age of 23, I was hired as the music teacher at a now defunct all-girls private high school in Pottersville, New Jersey, called the Purnell School. Oh, sure, I thought I had it all together at the time, but in retrospect, I didn't know Scheisse from Shinola, which was a brand of shoe polish that was popular during the first decades of the 20th century. In retrospect, my apprenticeship as a teacher, that period that saw me fake it till I made it, lasted some 5 years. This doesn't mean that I ever stopped learning on the job. Well, hopefully I'll never stop getting better at what I do. It only means that it took me around 5 years to achieve what today I consider to be a passing competence at teaching. And so it was as well for Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844 to 1908. He was born into a land-owning family of the nobility. Nikolai's father, Andrey Petrovich Rimsky-Korsakov, 1784 to 1862, came from a long line of Imperial Russian government officials, from governors to generals in the Russian army. For our information, an ancestor named Ivan Nikolaevich Rimsky-Korsakov was Empress Catherine the Great's lover from 1778 to 1779, giving fresh meaning to the phrase, a well-connected family. Nikolai's older brother, Nikolai Andreyevich Rimsky-Korsakov, 1822 to 1871, was an officer in the Imperial Russian Navy. He was a navigator, hydrographer, and geographer. It was thanks to Vohen that Nikolai's own fascination with the sea and interest in the Navy led him to enlist in the Imperial Russian Navy in 1856 at the age of 12. Following his enlistment, Nikolai was packed off to the School of Mathematical and Navigational Sciences in St. Petersburg, where his brother Vohen had gone to school as well. Nikolai graduated and entered active duty in April 1862 at the age of 18. All the while, he had been attending the School of Mathematical and Navigational Sciences in St. Petersburg. Rimsky-Korsakov had also been taking piano and composition lessons. While, by his own admission, he wasn't much of a pianist, he loved music and had been seriously bitten by the composition bug. In November of 1861, at the age of 17, he had been introduced to a composer, pianist, and pedant named Mily Alexandrovich Balakirev, 1837 to 1910, there in St. Pete. Balakirev, in turn, introduced Rimsky-Korsakov to two of his students, an army officer named Cesar Antonovich Kui, 1835 to 1918, and a former army officer turned postal worker named Modest Petrovich Mussorgsky, 1839 to 1881. Rimsky-Korsakov became part of Balakirev's circle, later to be dubbed the Five with the addition of Alexander Porfiryevich Borodin, 1833 to 1887. The young naval ensign was thrilled to be part of Balakirev's circle. Quote, "With what delight I listened to real business discussions of instrumentation, part writing, etc. And besides, how much talking there was about current musical matters. All at once, I had been plunged into a new world unknown to me. That was truly a strong impression." Unquote. Rimsky-Korsakov took composition lessons with Balakirev and met with the circle whenever he was in port. Now, to call Rimsky-Korsakov's lessons with Balakirev peculiar is being most generous. Mily Balakirev was an excellent pianist and improviser, but completely untrained in the mechanics of musical composition, in harmony, counterpoint, musical form, and so forth. Consequently, his instructions to his students typically consisted of him handing them a score to, say, a movement from a Beethoven symphony, and saying, "Write one of these." It's a miracle that any member of the Five managed to accomplish anything, but excluding Cesar Kui, they were composers of genius, and collectively they cobbled together a musical style based not on the traditional grammar of Western concert music, but rather on Russian folk music. Now that statement requires a brief but spirited discussion. The birth of Russian concert music, a 19th century success story. The emergence of a concert music tradition in 19th century Russia must be considered one of the great success stories in the history of European art. Russia began the 19th century with virtually no native tradition of concert music. But by the end of the 19th century, Russian opera and orchestral music were thrilling audiences across the globe, and native Russian-trained musicians, particularly pianists, violinists, and singers, had begun to dominate the world's concert stages. By the end of the 19th century, Russia had two of the world's greatest schools of music, the St. Petersburg and Moscow conservatories. And by the turn of the 20th century, a gaggle of young Russian composers, among them Alexander Scriabin, Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and Sergei Prokofiev, were poised to turn the international music world upside down. The celebration of things Russian that led to the 19th century explosion of Russian concert music began in 1812, when Russia spanked Napoleon Bonaparte by destroying his Grande Armée. Overnight, Russia was acknowledged as one of Europe's great powers, and Russian national pride swelled accordingly. An important element of that pride, this new and magnified Russian self-identity, was the desire on the part of some artists to create an authentic Russian national art, a homegrown art that grew out of the spirit, traditions, and language of Russia, and not from Western European models and traditions. The single work that is credited for initiating the Russian concert tradition is the opera A Life for the Tsar, composed between 1834 and 1835 by Mikhail Ivanovich Glinka, 1804 to 1857. What made A Life for the Tsar so special was that it was a full-blown grand opera by a Russian-born composer, set in the Russian language, based on a tale of Russian heroism in the face of foreign peril, a work musically shaped by the idiosyncrasies of Russian folk music and the Russian language to which it is set. Glinka's contemporary, the critic Yanuary Neverov, addressed all of this when he wrote that, quote, Glinka has looked deeply into the character of our folk music, has observed all its characteristics, has studied and assimilated it, and then has given full freedom to his own fantasy, creating images that are purely Russian, clear, comprehensible, and familiar to us simply because they breathe a pure narodnost, that is, embodiment of the nation, because we hear in them native sounds, unquote. Yeah, for Glinka's contemporaries, A Life for the Tsar oozed authenticity, a Russian language opera that appeared to be intrinsically Russian. When Glinka died in 1857, he was canonized as the patron saint of Russian concert music, and among those who worshipped most fervently at the shrine of Glinka was a 20-year-old pianist and wannabe composer by the name of Nikolai Andreyevich Rimsky-Korsakov. The Russian Five. Only in Russia, where the musical vacuum was as big as its 9-time-zone landmass, could a rank compositional amateur like Balakirev have established himself as Glinka's successor. But even more amazing was the impact Balakirev was eventually to have on not just Russian music, but the entire European concert music establishment. During the 1860s, Balakirev gathered around him a group of amateur composers, hobbyists, whose day gigs had nothing to do with music. Cesar Cui was a career army officer. Modest Mussorgsky was an army officer turned post office clerk. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was a naval officer, and Alexander Borodin was a doctor and chemist. Collectively, Balakirev and his circle came to be called the Mogachaya Kuchka, which can be translated variously as the mighty heap, the magnificent few, the mighty handful, or simply the Five. The avowed mission of the Five was to do battle against the hegemony of German music in the holy cause of creating a Russian compositional tradition, one based on the spirit and often the actual substance of Russian folk music. Of the Five, Mussorgsky was the most original, and Rimsky-Korsakov the most prolific, polished, and, through his teaching, the most influential. Nikolai Andreyevich Rimsky-Korsakov, who faked it till he made it. Rimsky-Korsakov's compositional polish and influence were both the result of a job he took in 1871, a job for which he was completely unprepared, that of professor of composition, orchestration, and orchestra conductor at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. His experience stands as an inspiration for everyone who has taken a job for which they knew themselves to be unqualified. Writing in his memoirs more than 30 years later, Rimsky-Korsakov still marveled at the sheer chutzpah of his actions. Quote, during the summer of 1871, Azanchevsky, the director of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, asked me to join the faculty. Realizing that I was totally unprepared for the appointment, I gave no answer and promised to think the matter over. My own delusions won the day, and I accepted the offer. Had I ever studied at all, had I possessed a fraction more knowledge than I actually did, it would have been obvious to me that I could not and should not accept the appointment. I was a dilettante and knew nothing. At the time, I could not decently harmonize a chorale, had not written a single counterpoint in my life, and had hardly any notion of musical form. I did not even know the names of intervals or chords. In my compositions, I had attained what I had, instinctively, by ear. As to the conductor's art, having never conducted an orchestra, nor even rehearsed a single piece, I had no conception of it. And now Ozanchevsky took it into his head to offer a professorship to a musician so ill-formed, and the musician accepted without blinking." Unquote. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was 27 years old when he took the job. Let us hear it, please, for the incaution of youth, without which many great things would never have been accomplished. And great things were accomplished thanks to Rimsky-Korsakov's teaching position at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. In order to stay just a few lessons ahead of his students, he had to first teach himself harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, and conducting, for all of which, as it turned out, he had a genius. As both a composer and a teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov was then able to unite the nationalist musical dogma of the five with Western European compositional technique. In the process, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, one-time musical dilettante, became one of the most important teachers in the entire history of music, numbering among his students Sergei Prokofiev, Anton Arensky, Alexander Glazunov, Nikolai Mayakovsky, and Igor Stravinsky. And Rimsky-Korsakov's influence as a teacher didn't stop there. Sergei Rachmaninov studied composition with Rimsky-Korsakov's student Anton Arensky. Rimsky-Korsakov's student Alexander Glazunov went on to become the director of the St. Petersburg Conservatory from 1905 to 1928, during which time he oversaw the musical education of the extraordinary Dmitri Shostakovich. Rimsky-Korsakov's student Nikolai Mayakovsky numbered among his students Aram Khachaturian, Dmitry Kabalevsky, and Evgeny Golubev. Among Golubev's students was Alfred Schnittke. It's a fact. The very history of 20th century Russian expatriate, and Soviet composers starts with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, whose own roots trace back through the five to Glinka and the awakening of Russian musical nationalism in the 1830s, itself an outgrowth of Napoleon's defeat in Russia in 1812. When we return in tomorrow's Dr. Bob Prescribes, it will be with Rimsky-Korsakov's justly popular Scheherazade of 1888 and the potentially controversial semi-rehabilitation on this site of a certain Swiss-born conductor. Thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.